If someone had told me a year ago that the complete and utter implosion of my car's transmission would be the best thing to ever happen to me, I would have prescribed them a heavy dose of reality. My life was a carefully curated terrarium of solitude. Predictable. Safe. I worked from home, a ghostwriter for people with more interesting lives than my own, and my car was the only bridge between my hermitage and the necessary evils of the outside world. Groceries. Post office. The occasional, soul-draining trip to the city. Its death was not an inconvenience. It was a severing. And the man who would either fix it or pronounce it dead was Grant. Grant's garage was the only one for 30 miles. A low-slung building of concrete block and corrugated metal, perpetually smelling of gasoline and hot iron. It was a place I actively avoided, not because of the service, which was rumored to be brutally efficient, but because of him, Grant. He was a landmark in our small town, as fixed and imposing as the old water tower. I'd only ever seen him from distance, pumping gas, leaning against the open bay door, arms crossed over a chest that seemed impossibly broad. He was always in motion, a contained storm of coiled muscle and quiet competence. Where he was perfectly still, a statue carved from grit and sunlight. He never smiled, at least not that I'd seen. His face, usually smudged with grease, was a mask of intense concentration or stoic indifference. He felt antagonistic, not to me, personally, to the world, a silent challenge to everything soft and uncertain. Everything like me. My routine was my armor. Wake at 6. Coffee. Write for 4 hours. Lunch. Edit for 4 hours. A walk through the woods behind my house. Dinner. Read. Sleep. The days bled into one another, a seamless, gray tapestry of my own weaving. It was a lonely existence, but its predictability was a balm to a mind that tended to spiral. I had built walls, not of brick, but of habit. Grant was a sledgehammer standing just outside those walls. And now, my bridge to the world was broken, and I had no choice but to walk into his territory and ask for help. The tow truck deposited my traitorous sedan in his lot, and I stood there, feeling like a supplicant at the gates of a hostile kingdom. The distance I had so carefully maintained was about to be obliterated. He emerged from the shadowy maw of the garage, wiping his hands on a red rag. Up close, he was larger. The air around him seemed to hum with a low-grade energy. He didn't look at me, not at first. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue in his sun-weathered face, were fixed on my car, his expression a mixture of professional diagnosis and pure disgust. "She's dead," I said, the words feeling flimsy and stupid in the heavy air. He grunted, a sound from deep in his chest. He finally looked at me, and his gaze was like a physical touch. Direct, unflinching. It stripped away my carefully constructed layers of invisibility. I felt my shoulders hunch, a reflexive cringe. "Might be," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like gravel turning over. "Leave the keys, that was it. No paperwork. No pleasantries. Just a command." It was the perfect confirmation of everything I'd assumed him to be. Arrogant, dismissive, a man who dealt in metal and machines, not in the fragile anxieties of their owners. I was just another problem to be solved or discarded. I dropped the keys on the cluttered counter inside the small, stuffy office. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and rubber. An old calendar from a decade ago hung crookedly on the wall, a pin-up model smiling down on a landscape of greasy invoices and spare parts. It was a world entirely alien to my own, a world of tangible things, of problems that could be fixed with the right tool and enough force. My world was one of words and shadows, of feelings that couldn't be torqued into place. I walked the 5 miles home, the sun beating down on my neck. Each step felt like a retreat. I had breached the perimeter, made contact with the monolith, and survived. But the encounter left a strange residue, an echo of that blue-eyed stare, a vibration from that rumbling voice. I went back to my routine, but a crack had appeared in the wall, a small, hairline fracture through which an unwelcome light was beginning to seep. The call came the next day, a number I didn't recognize. "It's Grant, just that." An announcement. The transmission is shot. Completely, I waited. I imagined him on the other end, leaning against a toolbox, the red rag tucked into the back pocket of his worn jeans. Can you fix it? I asked, my voice small. A pause. A sigh that sounded less like frustration and more like profound weariness. Can, but it's a rebuild, not a replacement. The part for this model, it's a ghost. Have to machine some of it myself. It'll take time, and it won't be cheap time. The one thing I had in abundance. It stretched before me, a vast, empty expanse. Now, it will be punctuated by the knowledge that this man, this stranger, was intimately involved in the mechanics of my life. He was holding a vital piece of my engineered solitude in his hands. Okay, I said. Do it. Need you to come in, he said. Sign the work order. Put down a deposit for the parts, of course. Another trip. Another forced interaction. The disruption was no longer a single event. It was becoming a process. A siege. He was systematically dismantling my defenses without even knowing they were there. So I walked the 5 miles again. This time, the journey felt different. Less like a retreat, more like an unwilling pilgrimage. My quiet life had been interrupted, put on hold by a broken piece of machinery and the one man who could fix it. And I found myself thinking not about the cost or the inconvenience, but about him. About the unexpected note of weariness in his voice. About the phrase, it's a ghost, a strangely poetic choice for a man I'd pegged as little more than a brute. The garage was louder this time. The hiss of an air tool, the clang of metal on concrete. He was underneath a massive truck, only his heavy work boots visible. I stood awkwardly by the office door, unsure of what to do. He slid out on a creeper, a fluid, powerful movement. He was covered in a fine sheen of sweat, and a dark smear of oil cut a sharp line across his cheekbone. He sat up and looked at me, and for a second, just a split second, the professional mask slipped. I saw something else in his eyes. Not arrogance, not indifference, just a deep, profound tiredness. It was a flicker of vulnerability, so fleeting I thought I might have imagined it. Then it was gone. He was all business again, pushing a clipboard into my hands. Sign at the bottom. I was being forced into proximity, forced to share the same air, to stand within the radius of his physical presence. My carefully ordered world was beginning to spin off its axis, and I was terrified. And, to my even greater terror, I was a little bit thrilled. The gray tapestry was unraveling, and I had no idea what colors lay hidden underneath. The days that followed were a study in dislocation. My house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was empty. The woods behind the house seemed less like a place of solace, and more like a barrier, fencing me in. I couldn't write. The words felt hollow. The fictional lives I was crafting seemed absurd compared to the very real, very mechanical drama unfolding 5 miles down the road. I needed updates. That was the excuse I gave myself. A practical reason to break my own rules. So I started walking to the garage. Not every day, every other day. I told myself it was just to check on the progress, to see if he needed anything, to understand the timeline of my return to normalcy. It was a lie, of course. A thin, pathetic lie. I was going to see him. He never seemed surprised to see me. He would just nod, a quick, sharp dip of his chin, and point to the dissected corpse of my car's engine. The parts were laid out on a workbench like surgical instruments. He would talk to me in a language I didn't understand, a dialect of gaskets and solenoids and planetary gear sets. He'd point with a thick, calloused finger, the nail permanently rimmed with black. And I would watch him. I became an observer, a chronicler of Grant. I noticed the way the muscles in his forearms bunched and coiled when he tightened a bolt. I saw the network of fine white scars that crisscrossed his knuckles, old stories of slipped wrenches and sharp metal. I noticed a small, faded tattoo just visible at the collar of his t-shirt, the tail of a scorpion. Maybe he was a man of intense focus. When he worked, the world outside that engine bay ceased to exist. His brow would furrow, his jaw would set, and there was a grace to his movements, a brutal economy that was almost beautiful. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a craftsman, a sculptor working in steel and oil. One afternoon, I found him staring at a small, intricate piece of metal in his palm, his shoulders slumped. He looked defeated. It was the first time I had seen anything but absolute confidence in his posture. "What is it?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't look up. "This damn clutch drum. The splines are worn in a way I've never seen. It's wrong. I can build a new one, but it's going to take another day." At least, he sounded frustrated. Not angry, just frustrated. With the metal, with the world, with the limitations of his own considerable skill. "I'm in no hurry," I said, and it was true. The thought of my car being fixed, of my excuse to be here vanishing, sent a small, cold stone of panic dropping into my stomach. He finally looked at me then. A long, searching look. "You're the writer, right? The one who lives up in the old Henderson place." I nodded, surprised he knew. I'd been in this town for 3 years and felt largely invisible. "Must be quiet up there," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an observation. "That's the idea," I replied. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, I get that." He turned back to the clutch drum, the moment of connection severed. But it lingered in the air between us, a shared acknowledgement of the appeal of silence, of solitude. I had assumed we were opposites, but maybe our walls were just built from different materials. The next day, I brought him a thermos of coffee. It felt like a ridiculous, domestic gesture, something from another life. I almost turned back 3 times on the walk over, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, trap bird rhythm. I held it out to him without a word. He stopped what he was doing, his hands hovering over the engine. He looked at the thermos, then at my face. He slowly wiped his hands on his ever-present red rag, the gesture deliberate, and took it from me. Our fingers brushed. It wasn't a spark. It was a forest fire. A jolt of pure, unadulterated heat shot up my arm, short-circuiting my brain. Every nerve ending stood at attention. It was nothing, a fraction of a second of incidental contact, but it was the first time I had touched another person in. I couldn't even remember how long. Months. Maybe longer. My breath hitched. I'm sure he noticed. I'm sure my eyes went wide with a kind of primal panic. I wanted to run, to retreat back to my sterile, safe house and bleach the sensation from my skin. But I was paralyzed, caught in the tractor beam of his gaze. He didn't pull away. His fingers lingered against mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. His callous skin was rough against my own, a landscape of hard work and friction. He said nothing. He just held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of something new. Surprise. And something else. Something I couldn't name. A question, maybe. Then he took the thermos, his fingers wrapping around the cool metal. "Thanks," he mumbled, turning away to pour the coffee into a stained mug. The connection was broken. The air rushed back into my lungs. My heart was a chaotic drum solo in my chest. I felt dizzy, exposed. That single, fleeting touch had told a story I wasn't ready to write. It spoke of loneliness and longing. It was a confession made without a single word. I fled. I mumbled something about needing to get back and practically ran out of the garage, the sound of my own pulse roaring in my ears. The 5-mile walk home felt like a marathon through a hostile country. I had gone there to observe him, and in one careless moment, I had revealed everything about myself. The thaw had begun, and I was terrified of what would happen when all the ice melted away. A few days later, a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the air grew thick and heavy, charged with a nervous energy that mirrored my own. I was at the garage, ostensibly to check on the final stages of the rebuild. The real reason, the one I wouldn't admit even to myself, was to see if the world had tilted back onto its axis since the touch. It hadn't. The space between us was now a live wire. We were careful not to stand too close, not to let our hands get near each other. The easy, observational dynamic was gone, replaced by a tense, unspoken awareness. It was maddening and electrifying. The rain started as a few fat, lazy drops, then became a torrent, a solid sheet of water that blurred the world outside the bay doors. The wind howled, rattling the metal roof. Then, with a sudden violent crack of thunder that shook the concrete floor, the lights flickered and died. We were plunged into a sudden, profound darkness. The only light was the occasional, ghostly blue flash of lightning from outside, freezing the garage in stark, momentary tableaus. The only sound was the roar of the storm and our own breathing. Damn it, Grant's voice came out of the blackness, closer than I expected. Generator must not have kicked in. My heart was pounding, a frantic rhythm against the percussion of the rain. The darkness was absolute, disorienting. It stripped away all the pretense, all the safe distances. We were just two people in a metal box, surrounded by a world gone wild. Fuse, probably, he said, more to himself than to me. I heard him moving, a soft shuffling of boots on the oil-stained floor. Stay put. Don't want you tripping over an engine block. A flash of lightning illuminated him for a second. He was a silhouette, broad and solid, moving toward the back office. Then darkness again. I stood frozen, my arms wrapped around myself. The smell of the rain, of wet earth and ozone, mixed with the familiar sense of the garage, creating a strange, primal perfume. I heard a curse, followed by the sound of something metal clattering to the floor. You okay? I called out, my voice tight. A heavy sigh from the darkness. Yeah, just can't see a thing. Sliced my hand on a damn filing cabinet. My writer's brain, the part of me that lived in hypotheticals and what-ifs, had played out 1,000 scenarios. But it had never once come up with this. Me, the recluse who treated a paper cut like a major medical event, and him, the bastion of physical competence, injured in the dark. I have a light, I said, my voice shaking slightly as I fumbled for my phone. And a first aid kit in my bag. The beam from my phone's flashlight cut through the gloom, finding him near the office door. He was holding his hand, and a dark line of blood was welling up from a gash across his palm. It looked deep. The power dynamic shifted in that instant. He wasn't the invincible monolith anymore. He was just a man, bleeding in the dark. And I, for the first time, was the one with the tools. Sit down, I said, surprised by the authority in my own voice. He didn't argue. He sat on an overturned bucket, his big frame looking suddenly diminished in the narrow cone of light. I knelt in front of him, placing my bag on the floor and pulling out the small, well-stocked first aid kit I carried everywhere. Anxious habit, neurotic preparedness. For the first time, it felt useful. Let me see, I murmured. He extended his hand into the light. It was a stark contrast. His large, calloused, grease-stained hand, and my own, pale and trembling slightly. The cut was clean, but bleeding steadily. I took his hand in mine to steady it, and the contact was a quiet explosion. There was no jolt this time, no panic. Just a deep, resonant warmth that spread through my chest. His skin was rough, but his hand was steady in mine. He was letting me do this. He was trusting me. I worked in silence, cleaning the wound with an antiseptic wipe, my movements careful and precise. He watched my face, his own expression unreadable in the flickering light of my phone, which I'd propped up on a nearby workbench. The storm raged outside, a soundtrack to our strange, silent intimacy. You're good at that, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through my own hands. My mom was a nurse. I replied, my eyes focused on applying a butterfly bandage to pull the edges of the cut together. And I'm clumsy, a small, self-deprecating joke to try and break the spell. It didn't work. The spell was too strong. The world had shrunk to this small circle of light, to the task at hand, to the feeling of his skin against mine. I could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his pulse beneath my thumb. I finished wrapping his palm with gauze, my fingers moving with a confidence I didn't know I possessed. There, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It probably needs stitches, but this will hold it for now. I should have let go. The job was done, but I didn't. My hand lingered on his, my thumb stroking gently over his wrist. He didn't pull away. Instead, he used his other hand to cover mine, his large, warm fingers enclosing my own completely. It wasn't a restraining gesture. It was an anchor. Leo, he said. It was the first time he'd used my name. The sound of it in his deep voice was a revelation. It made me feel seen. Solid. Why do you come here every day? He asked, his voice quiet, raw. The question I'd been dreading. The lie I'd been telling myself. It crumbled to dust in the face of his directness. I couldn't look at him. I stared at our joined hands, illuminated in the pale light. His wounded and strong. Mine, holding on like a lifeline. Because my car is here, I whispered, the excuse sounding pathetic even to my own ears. No, he said, his voice gentle but firm. That's not it. Lightning flashed, and in that brief, brilliant moment, I saw his face clearly. The exhaustion was gone. The professional mask was gone. In its place was a naked vulnerability that mirrored my own. A deep, aching loneliness I recognized because I saw it in the mirror every morning. The thunder rolled, a long, low growl that faded into the sound of the rain, and the words just fell out of me. A confession whispered into the storm. I don't know, because it's loud here, and my house is too quiet. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a piece of it, a piece I could dare to give him. He squeezed my hand, a gentle, reassuring pressure. My house is quiet, too, he admitted, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. Too damn quiet. We sat there in the dark, the storm our chaperone, our hands clasped together. The silence between us was no longer tense. It was full. It was a conversation all its own, speaking of walls and wounds and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of someone else seeing the person you kept hidden inside. He shifted, his knee brushing against mine. Another point of contact, another current flowing between us. He didn't move it away. He leaned in closer. I could feel the warmth of his breath, could smell the faint, clean scent of soap beneath the grease and rain. My own breath caught in my throat. This is it, the moment the world changes. Leo, he whispered again, his voice a rough velvet in the dark. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss like in the books I sometimes wrote. It was slow, hesitant, a question. His lips were chapped and firm against mine. It tasted of coffee and rain. He was gentle, so incredibly gentle, as if he were handling something fragile, something precious. As if he were afraid I might break. I leaned into him, my free hand coming up to cup his jaw, my fingers tracing the rough stubble there. I was answering his question. Yes, this is real. Yes, this is what I want. The kiss deepened, but the gentleness remained. It was an exploration, a discovery. It was the breaking down of the final wall, not with a sledgehammer, but with a quiet, persistent pressure that my own defenses simply melted under. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, our hands still linked between us. The storm was beginning to pass, the thunder a distant rumble now, the rain a softer patter on the roof. He started, then stopped. Me too, I whispered, having no idea what he was going to say, but knowing the sentiment was shared. In the charged, intimate darkness of the broken-down garage, surrounded by the ghosts of dead machines, something new and terrifyingly alive had just been built between us. I woke up to the unfamiliar sound of bird song and the scent of motor oil on my pillow. I was in my own bed, alone. For a moment, confusion fogged my brain. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back, a tidal wave of sensation and emotion. The storm. The darkness, his hand in mine, his mouth on mine. After the kiss, the world had slowly come back online. The rain had softened to a drizzle. He found a flashlight and managed to reset the breaker. The garage was flooded with harsh, fluorescent light, and the intimacy of the darkness evaporated like mist. We were suddenly awkward. Two strangers who had shared something profound, now standing under the unforgiving glare of reality. He had insisted on driving me home. The ride was silent, but it was a thick, charged silence, not an empty one. My broken car sat in his bay, but I was being driven in his truck, a beast of a machine that felt like an extension of the man himself. Solid, powerful, a little intimidating. At my door, he'd simply said, "Car will be ready tomorrow." Then he'd touched my arm, a brief, warm pressure, and left. Now, in the cold light of morning, anxiety began its insidious creep. It was a mistake, a trick of the storm, an aberration born of darkness and proximity. He was just being kind after I patched up his hand. The kiss was a moment of madness. My stomach was a tangled knot of bees. I replayed every second, dissecting it, analyzing it, searching for flaws. His hesitation, my clumsy response, the awkward silence afterward. My mind, my greatest enemy, was building a case for rejection. He would regret it. He would be professional and distant when I went to pick up the car, and we would never speak of it again. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, cold blade twisting in my gut. The solitude I had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a punishment. The quiet of my house wasn't peaceful. It was mocking. It echoed with the ghost of his presence, the low rumble of his voice. I had let him in. I had opened the gate, and now I was standing in the ruins of my own carefully constructed peace, waiting for the final blow. I couldn't go back to the garage. Not yet. I couldn't face him. So I waited. The day crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. I tried to write, but the words were ash in my mouth. I tried to read, but the sentences swam before my eyes. Every time a car drove down the main road, my head would snap up, my heart leaping into my throat. By late afternoon, the silence from his end was deafening. It was a physical weight, pressing down on me, confirming my worst fears. He regretted it. He was ashamed. He was erasing it, and me, from his memory. I was a fool. A lonely, pathetic fool who had mistaken a moment of shared vulnerability for something more. I had projected all my own secret longings onto him, a man who was probably just being a decent human being. The self-recrimination was a bitter tide. I had broken my own primary rule: do not risk your heart. I had let the walls crumble for a taste of something I thought was real, and now I was left with nothing but the rubble and the stinging knowledge of my own desperation. My phone, which had been silent all day, suddenly felt like a bomb on my kitchen counter. I stared at it. Should I call? What would I even say? Hey, about that kiss in the dark during the biblical thunderstorm, was that just a weird weather phenomenon, or? The thought was mortifying. No, the ball was in his court. He had said the car would be ready today. He would have to call. And when he did, his tone would tell me everything I needed to know. It would be brisk, professional, the mechanic calling a client. And I would have to pretend that my heart wasn't shattering into a million tiny pieces. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that felt like a personal insult. Another day was ending. A day of silence. A day of absence. My brief, beautiful connection had been a phantom. The man who had felt so real in the dark was gone, and the strong, silent, intimidating mechanic was back in his place. The hope that had flickered to life inside me began to die, starved of oxygen. The old, familiar grayness started to seep back in, covering everything. My routine, my solitude, it was waiting to reclaim me. But it was different now. Before, it was a comfort. Now it was a prison. A prison whose walls were papered with the memory of a kiss that tasted like rain. And the silence stretched on. 2 days. 48 hours of silence, so profound it felt like a sound in itself. A high-pitched ringing in my ears that was the pure, undiluted sound of absence. I didn't leave the house. I paced the floors like a caged animal, from the window overlooking the road to the phone on the kitchen counter. My anxiety had metastasized, growing into a full-blown certainty. I had imagined it all. The vulnerability in his eyes, the gentleness of his touch. I had created a fiction because I was so starved for connection. My car was finished. It had to be. He was just avoiding the awkwardness of the final transaction. Maybe he'd left it out with the keys in it. Maybe he'd mailed me the bill. My mind concocted 100 different scenarios, each one more humiliating than the last. On the evening of the second day, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than the rejection. I had to rip the bandage off. I would walk down there, pay my bill, get my keys, and drive away. I would be polite, detached. I would put the walls back up, stone by painful stone. I was putting on my shoes, my hands shaking, when I heard it. The unmistakable rumble of a heavy-duty truck engine coming up my long, gravel driveway. My blood ran cold. My heart stopped, then restarted with a painful, frantic gallop. It could only be one person. I stood frozen in my hallway, unable to move, listening as the engine cut out. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then, a car door opened and closed. Footsteps on the gravel. Slow, deliberate. He was here, at my house, my sanctuary, my fortress. He was walking right up to the front door. A knock. 3 solid, definite raps. I stared at the door as if it were a portal to another dimension. My mind was screaming at me to hide, to pretend I wasn't home. But my feet, acting on some instinct I didn't know they possessed, carried me forward. I opened the door. He stood on my porch, backlit by the fading twilight. He wasn't wearing his greasy work clothes. He was in a clean, dark t-shirt and jeans. He looked out of place. A mountain moved from its familiar landscape. His shoulders were slumped, and the confidence I always associated with him was gone. In its place was an exhaustion that seemed bone-deep and a raw, startling uncertainty. He was holding my car keys in his hand, dangling them from one finger. He looked as wrecked as I felt. "Your car's ready," he said, his voice raspy low. He didn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the keys as if they were the most interesting thing in the world. You drove it here?" I stammered. He nodded, still not looking at me. Figured I should. The silence stretched, thin, and brittle. This was it, the moment of truth. "Grant," I said, but my voice was steadier than I expected. "What's going on?" He finally lifted his head, and his blue eyes were clouded with turmoil. "I'm an idiot," he said, the words a harsh rasp. I panicked, my breath caught. "That night," he started, then shook his head, running his free hand through his short hair. It wasn't the storm, Leo. It wasn't the dark. It was real, and it scared the hell out of me. The relief that washed over me was so intense it made my knees weak. It wasn't me. I hadn't imagined it. He had felt it too. "I'm not good at this," he continued, his gaze finally locking with mine. It was a plea. Words. Feelings. All of it. I fix things. I know engines and transmissions. They make sense. You don't make sense. And I didn't want to break you. The raw honesty of his confession cracked open my own chest. He thought he would break me? The man who had been so impossibly gentle? "You didn't break me," I whispered. "You were the opposite of that." The silence, that's what was breaking me. "I thought you regretted it." A flicker of pain crossed his face. "Regret it? I haven't been able to think about anything else. I've taken apart a perfectly good carburetor 3 times in the last 2 days because my head wasn't on straight." He took a step closer, invading my space, my porch, my life. "I've been alone a long time, Leo. It gets to be a habit, a hard one to break." I didn't know what the next step was. We stood there just inches apart, 2 hermits who had accidentally stumbled out of their caves and found each other. All the fear, all the anxiety of the past 2 days melted away, replaced by a fragile, terrifying hope. "So what's the next step now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He looked down at the keys in his hand, then back at me. He held them out. "Step 1 is you take your keys." I took them. Our fingers brushed, and this time the electricity was familiar. "Welcome." "Step 2, he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming intensely serious, "is you tell me if I can come inside." He wasn't just asking to enter my house. He was asking to enter my life. He was standing on the threshold, vulnerable and uncertain, waiting for an invitation. He had returned. He had explained. He had laid his own fear bare. I stepped back, pulling the door open wider. "Yes," I said, the word feeling bigger and more important than any I had ever written. "Please, come in." He walked past me into my house, and the quiet space was suddenly filled with his presence. It wasn't an invasion. It felt like a completion, like a missing piece I never knew my life had, finally clicking into place. The silence was over. A new conversation was just beginning. We didn't talk much at first. Words felt inadequate, clumsy. He stood in the middle of my living room, a room filled with books and soft light, and looked around as if he'd entered a foreign country. He seemed too large for the space, too solid. His presence was a stark, masculine contrast to my quiet, literary world. But it wasn't a clash. It was a balance. I made coffee, my hands moving on autopilot. He watched me, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen. His gaze was steady, intense, but the turmoil was gone. In its place was a quiet watchfulness. He was learning the landscape of my life, just as I had learned the landscape of his garage. I handed him a mug. "Thank you for bringing my car back," I said, breaking the silence. "It was an excuse," he said simply, taking a sip of the coffee. "I needed to see you. I just didn't know how to do it without a reason. You could have just come," I said softly. He looked at me over the rim of his mug, a small, wry smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines, making his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Yeah, well, I'm learning." We sat on my worn sofa, a careful foot of space between us, the coffee mugs warming our hands. The air was thick with unspoken things, but it wasn't tense anymore. It was expectant. "So," I said, because the silence was starting to feel heavy again. "Scorpion tattoo?" He looked surprised, then glanced down at his collar. "How did you—" He shook his head, that small smile returning. "Yeah, a stupid thing I got done when I was 18. A reminder to have a little sting. I guess you don't seem to have a problem with that." I offered, a hint of teasing in my voice. He laughed, a real laugh this time, a deep, rich sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "You'd be surprised," he said, his expression turning serious again. "Most of it's just armor. Just like my solitude, my routine. We were two soldiers who had finally laid down our weapons." He put his mug down on the coaster I'd slid onto the coffee table. He turned to face me, the cushions shifting with his weight, closing the distance between us. "I'm sorry I scared you," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I'm sorry I made you wait. I'm sorry I ran," I countered. "After you kissed me. I panicked too, so we're even," he said, his hand coming to rest on my knee. The warmth of it soaked through my jeans, a steady, grounding pressure. "Both panicked. Both idiots sound about right." I agreed, my own smile feeling more natural than it had in years. His thumb began to stroke back and forth on my knee, a small, repetitive gesture that was doing insane things to my nervous system. His gaze was locked on mine, and the air crackled with the energy that had been building between us for weeks. "So," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "can I try that again?" The kiss, without a thunderstorm and a power outage to blame it on, my heart did a slow, painful flip in my chest. I couldn't find the words, so I just nodded. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. He was asking for permission with his body, with his eyes. He was being careful with me. I met him halfway. This kiss was different. The first one had been a question mark in the dark. This was a statement. It was sure and deep, and full of all the anxiety and longing of the past few days. It was a promise. His hand left my knee and came up to cup my face, his callous palm rough and gentle against my cheek. I melted into him, my hands finding their way into his hair, which was softer than I'd imagined. We were starting over, right here in the quiet of my living room. This wasn't an accident. It was a choice. A terrifying, exhilarating, mutual choice. Later, as we were cleaning up the coffee mugs in the kitchen, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his wallet. It was the invoice for my car. He'd already marked it paid in full. He uncapped a pen, and on the bottom, below the technical jargon and the final, staggering price, he wrote his personal cell phone number. He circled it twice. He slid it across the counter to me. "That's not the garage number," he said. "That one's just for me. For whenever. For reasons that have nothing to do with cars." It was such a simple thing. A few digits on a piece of paper. But it felt monumental. It was a key. An invitation into the parts of his life that weren't open to the public. It was a tangible act of commitment, a symbolic gesture that said, "I am choosing this. I am choosing you." I picked up the invoice, my fingers tracing the circled number. I looked at him, standing in my kitchen as if he belonged there, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my life would never be the same. The breakdown was over. The rebuild was complete. And not just for my car. The mornings are different now. The first thing I'm aware of isn't the curated silence of my house, but the steady, slow rhythm of someone else's breathing beside me. The scent in the air isn't just old books and dust motes, but the warm, earthy smell of Grant skin mixed with the lingering aroma of the coffee we made together just before sunrise. His heavy work boots are a permanent fixture by my front door, right next to my worn-out walking shoes. They look like they're having a conversation. His red rag, washed and clean, is often draped over the back of a kitchen chair. His presence has seeped into the very structure of my house, of my life, filling in the empty spaces I didn't even know were there. We make coffee together, a silent, comfortable ritual. I grind the beans. He pours the water. We move around each other in the small kitchen with an easy, unpracticed grace. Sometimes our hands brush as we reach for the mugs, and the spark is still there, but now it's a gentle warmth, not a frightening jolt. It's the familiar hum of a well-tuned engine. We sit on the porch and watch the sun come up, the silence between us no longer a void to be filled, but a shared space of peace. He'll tell me about a difficult engine he's working on, and I'll tell him about a stubborn paragraph that won't cooperate. We speak different languages, but we understand each other perfectly. Sometimes I just watch him. I watch the way his brow furrows in concentration when he's reading the newspaper. I watch the surprising gentleness in his large hands as he refills the bird feeder in my yard. He is a man of quiet actions, of steadfast presence. His love isn't declared in flowery prose. It's built piece by piece, like one of his engines. It's in the way he makes sure my tires are properly inflated, the way he leaves a thermos of hot coffee on my desk when I'm lost in my work, the way he simply reaches for my hand when we're sitting on the sofa, a silent, anchoring touch. There is no more anxiety. The push and pull has settled into a steady, reliable orbit. The morning after is no longer a crucible of doubt, but a quiet celebration of the night before. Waking up next to him is an affirmation. It is the tangible proof that the fragile, beautiful thing we built in the dark survived the light of day. It thrived. My life, once a fortress of solitude, has become a shared home. My routine, once a shield, has become a flexible framework that now includes another person. It's not a disruption anymore. It's an upgrade. I look back at the man I was, the anxious, observant ghost, hiding from the world behind walls of habit. I was safe, yes, but I wasn't living. I was existing in a grayscale world of my own making. Grant was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the catastrophic engine failure that forced me onto a new road. He didn't just fix my car. He dismantled the broken-down machine of my life and rebuilt it into something stronger, something better, something that could not only handle the journey, but actually enjoy the ride. He was the chaos that led to peace, the noise that made the silence beautiful. He taught me that vulnerability isn't a weakness, but a bridge, and that sometimes the most terrifying risks, a shared look, a hesitant touch, a whispered confession in a storm, lead to the greatest rewards. He didn't just leave his number on that invoice. He left an indelible mark on my soul. He showed me that home isn't a place you build to keep the world out. It's a person you finally let in.